Jesus said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say, it's going to rain. And it does. And when the south wind blows, you say, it's going to be hot. And it is. You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? A gospel inspired by God. There was an Indian guru one time who said very famously, he said, if you're walking in the forest and you come across the tracks of religion, follow them. But do not follow where they are leading. Follow where they have come from. I want to talk about this bit today, and I want to compare it with what Jesus just said, because Jesus is comparing the science of weather forecasting in his time with the science of spirituality. And he's finding the science of spirituality very, very lacking in his time. So there are the issues I want to address this morning, and I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. The first one I will call the long, sad journey from mystical spirituality to inquisitional, crusading religion. Nice, pithy little title. And the second one will be the long, sad journey from childlike curiosity to intolerant, weaponized scientism. Another pithy little title. The third one I will call the marriage of science and spirituality. Fourthly, I'm going to talk about the science of spirituality, and then fourthly, the spirituality of science. So they're the 5 points I'll make this morning. So the first one then, the long, sad journey from the mystical spirituality to intolerant, crusading, inquisitional religion. In 1870, a very famous English Catholic, an aristocrat, which was very unusual because the aristocracy in England were 99% Protestant, but there was one guy, a guy called Lord Acton, a very, very dedicated Catholic, who, when the Vatican Council, the First Vatican Council was called in 1869, and the main item on the agenda was going to be papal infallibility. They were going to try to push through the notion of papal infallibility for the first time. After 1870 years, they finally decided the Pope was infallible. And he was outraged by this. And he's responsible for the very famous statement, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was applying it to this very situation. Although he was a very, very staunch Catholic, he was of the opinion that when you give anybody that kind of power, it corrupts them. And that kind of absolute power, that any one person could be infallible, this was, he felt, a very, very serious breach. And he rallied against it for months and months and months before the council began. The council, of course, pushed it through. And so, when you actually look at it, this was, in some senses, the culmination, after 1870 years, it was the culmination of the bureaucratization of the Jesus movement. So when you look at every religion initially starts out as some kind of a mystical impulse. Some great prophet or prophetess has a Gnostic encounter, has a deep, deep, deep mystical encounter. And this changes their lives. And they begin speaking about their experience, and eventually they have a group of followers. Some people find this new insight fascinating and they want to be associated with the teacher. So they gather around the teacher, or the prophet, whatever you want to call him. At some stage, however, the prophet is going to die. Either a natural death, which is most unlikely, or an unnatural death, which is much more likely. Most prophets get killed, assassinated in some way. So the prophet gets killed or dies. And now the followers they organize themselves into a little community. It's the next stage. The community at some stage is taken over by a bureaucracy. When the bureaucracy gets in charge, then you get all kinds of intolerance within the system. So they create the notion of sin, and mortal sin in particularly, and they purport to be able to determine your eternal fate. They can tell you which people are going to go to heaven afterwards or go to hell afterwards. And they'll introduce all kinds of inquisitions among their own members to ferret out those who don't believe the dogma, the new dogma. And then, when they're powerful enough, they institute crusades against the outsiders, and they go across, in the case of Christianity, across Europe, wiping out Orthodox Christians, Jews, and Muslims in their path. So this is the track that happens. So what happens is, you start with the mystics, and then at some stage, when the mystics are suppressed, the theologians take over. And the theologians are the people who create dogmatic systems, interlocking, consistent systems, which are totally made up. Because most theologians haven't had mystical experiences themselves, and so they're dealing with a second-hand phenomenon, and they're trying to make sense of it in rational logic, so they create dogma. So the theologians take over from the mystics. But at some stage, the theologians are displaced by the bureaucrats. And the bureaucrats then take charge of the community or the religion or the organization, and now the theologians just become court historians. They're preaching what they're told, what the bureaucrats tell them they want to preach. So now we've gone from mystics to theologians to the bureaucrats who are in charge. And that tends to be what happens with all these systems. That is the movement of all these systems. And you wind up finally then with a system that doesn't look anything like what it started out to be. So the mystical impulse inevitably winds up as some form of religion. And then truth begins to suffer, and curiosity begins to suffer as well. And then we wind up just with mere religion instead of deep mystical spirituality. That's my first point. The second point is, I believe that something very similar happens to scientific inquiry. And so my second point is the long, sad journey from childlike curiosity to intolerant, militarized or weaponized scientism. Now, there's a big difference between scientism and science. The essence of science is that it is a curiosity about how life is, how the world works, or how the universe, evolved. It's this childlike curiosity wedded to a very, very interesting system, a system that allows you to empirically begin to try to construct how the system might work. So it starts with this childlike curiosity. That's the essence of the scientific method. And basically it goes through the following kinds of stages, no matter what the discipline is, whether you're talking about physics, or you're talking about geology, or you're talking about anthropology, whatever it is. You start off, the scientist begins to make a bunch of observations in her field. And the observations lead to data. So she amasses a whole bunch of data. And now she begins to peruse her data to find out, are there any kind of putative patterns beginning to emerge in the data? And when she thinks she's found some kind of a possible pattern, she creates a hypothesis to explain how the pattern could have arisen. Now, the next stage is she has to try to create an experiment to test her hypothesis. And if it turns out that the hypothesis is correct, then this experiment has to be replicated in several other laboratories, because it's possible that her results were mere statistical chance. So they have to be replicated in 4 or 5 more laboratories. And if they all come up with the same result, then you've got a new scientific principle. And when you put together a bunch of scientific principles that have been, reached through this methodology, now you have a scientific model in the field. And that model then allows them to continue to research. But inevitably, when you research some more, new anomalous data begin to raise their heads. And now you've got a problem. You have to start tweaking the old model to try to accommodate the new data. And sometimes it's creaking at the seams to try to accommodate the new data. But mostly you can do it. But at some stage, so much new anomalous data begin to become available that the old model simply can't do it anymore. No matter how much you try to tweak it, it can't accommodate the new data. And then you have to come to the awful realization that you've got to, in some sense, dismantle the old model and erect a new model that can accommodate and explain all the old stuff as well as all the new stuff as well. And it happened twice in the 20th century with relativity theory, 1905, the famous paper by Einstein, and in the 1920s with quantum mechanics. So this is the essence of the scientific method. That's how it proceeds. Unfortunately, that's the ideal. The problem, of course, is that scientists are human beings as well. And that scientists are in some kinds of clubs, and there are people who are organizing and administering their activities. And so inevitably, something else begins to happen. And the inevitability is that it gets taken over, just like religion gets taken over by some kind of an institutionalization or a bureaucracy that then dictates to the theologians and to and suppresses the mystics. The same thing begins to happen in the scientific model. The very, very same thing. What happens is scientism becomes a new religion. You can look at all the hallmarks of religion and you begin to identify them in scientism as well. Is there a priesthood there? There definitely is. The priesthood are the trained, scientists. Are there special kind of churches or buildings? Yeah, we call them laboratories. Is there special kinds of vestments? Yeah, there's the white lab coat or whatever. Are there special kinds of liturgies? Yeah, there's a protocol, and there are particular kinds of instruments that you have to use, microscopes or telescopes or whatever, or big colliders, like SLAC or whatever. Are there saints? Yeah, we call them the Nobel laureates. Are there scriptures in it? Yeah, we call it peer-reviewed journals. Yeah, is there excommunication employed? Absolutely. People who begin to think outside the box are excommunicated from the system. So you look at all the hallmarks of religion which has become institutionalized and bureaucratized, and you get the very same movement within scientism, because it's peopled by human beings. And then the ultimate insult is that just like, a religion can wind up, a religion dedicated to Jesus Christ who said, love your enemies, can wind up actually mass murdering millions of its own people through inquisitions and of other people through crusades. And you get the same tendency happening in scientism of our times. Scientism has been prostituted to the military-industrial complex. The vast bulk of research money at this stage is given by people like DARPA, the defense, the militarization. Most of the money is coming from there. And people who think outside the box and want to investigate stuff which is of interest to them, they can't get research funding, they can't get published in peer-reviewed magazines, and because they can't, they have to publish elsewhere, and because they're publishing elsewhere, nobody takes them seriously. If you want to study stuff like reincarnation or prayer, the scientific community won't allow you to do that because it's outside the box. And since the scientific method can't study those kinds of things, because the methodology can't study it, therefore it's not real. And because it's not real, we can dismiss it out of hands. So when you look at what has happened, we're looking at the prostitution of science. Obviously, there are some real good scientists still there doing real good stuff. But for the main part, their genius is being prostituted to the military-industrial complex. Almost everything is weaponized. You can get funding for anything which will lead to bigger, better bombers that can kill a lot more people a lot further away. But we do it even in domestic science. You look at, for instance, what's happened to agriculture. Agriculture has become agribusiness. And you get not only the prostitution of agricultural science to groups like Monsanto, but you get the revolving door, where big executives from Monsanto will resign their positions, be appointed to government, to the Ministry of Agriculture, push through legislation that privileges GMOs or something else, and then once the legislation has gone through, they resign their position in government and go back into Monsanto and get a huge big bonus for it. So there you have agricultural science prostituted to the Monsantos of the world. You get the same thing in our healthcare. Mostly it's not healthcare anymore, it's managed illness. And there's a huge difference between healthcare and managed illness. The pharmaceutical industry is not that interested in curing any disease. It's interested in managing diseases so they can continue to sell their multi-billion-dollar industry. So you've got the kind of the science of healing being prostituted to the big pharma of the world. I was just listening to a podcast on my way down from home on Thursday night. A man from Sloan Kettering, which is one of the big cancer research groups, and he's a whistleblower. And it seemed that in the 1970s there was a very promising possibility of a cure for cancer called Latril. Have you heard of that? Yeah. And so Sloan Kettering got behind it, and there was a Chinese-American scientist who was showed with really great research that this very simple substance is it's the pit of the apricot. That's basically what it is. Was able to retard completely cancers in mice, and even to drive it backwards. And they put 2 years of research into this with extraordinary results. So they brought it before the FDA in order to kind of push it, and the FDA freaked out. And there were posters went up in 20,000 post offices in the United States of America saying it was forbidden to either be a patient accepting this treatment or a doctor promoting this treatment. And it was totally crushed. And Sloan Kettering were really disappointed, but they went back home and they rethought their position, and then they sent out a document saying that the initial results actually weren't positive at all, and they totally reversed themselves. And this guy was part of the organization, and he blew the whistle. And he's spent the last 20 years trying to point out exactly what happened. So this happens again and again and again. So you get something like the FDA, which allegedly is the watchdog on behalf of the American population, guaranteeing our health care, being captured and being prostituted to the pharmaceutical industry. We get the very same thing, obviously, with the weaponization. We have a peace force right now. The old system was that the policeman in the community was the peace officer. He knew everybody in the community, and his job was to promote and to protect peace. Almost never did these guys draw a gun and have a shootout. Now the entire thing has been, it's managed brutality. It's what's happened with it. And so you're prostituting weaponry in the service of dominating the people. So again and again and again, the science runs the same risk that spirituality runs, of being taken over, by the bureaucrats and turned into something for which it was never intended. That's my second point. Third point, I want to say, what does it look like then when you get a real marriage between real science and deep spirituality, rather than between, pseudoscience and fundamentalist religion? What happens when you get this kind of a crossover between them? Then you got something really, really beautiful happening here at this stage. Firstly, you begin to realize that it is a false fight. That this, animosity between science and spirituality is a false fight. It is not a real fight. It's a war that's taking place between fundamentalist Christians with their caricature God and scientism with a God-shaped hole in the human psyche. And so the caricature of God that fundamentalist religion creates fits very, very nicely into the hole created by scientism in their claim that there is no such thing as God. They're absolutely right. There is no such thing as the God, the caricature of God that we find in fundamentalist religion, so they're right there, but they then make the mistake of claiming there is nothing else. God does not exist. So what happens when you get these two really coming together and you get a realization that they're the male and the female of the psyche of the immanence of God? What happens when you get this? Then you get real science. You get the ability to really, really look with wonder and with awe at human experiences. Science should be interested in and should be willing to try to explore any human experience, and not say some human experiences, they're imagined, they couldn't be real, our method can't identify what they are, so they don't exist. So the first thing that science needs to realize in this marriage is the realization that the scientific method itself is based on faith. Science likes to believe that, it's a totally logical, consistent system which doesn't call for any act of faith whatsoever. That's palpably not true. Mathematics, which I consider to be the queen of all the sciences, when I was studying math in college, it was based on the Peano postulates. There were 9 postulates created by a very famous Italian mathematician at the end of the 1800s. And if you accepted those 9 postulates, you could build very, very elegant mathematical systems. Now, if you accept fewer postulates, you can build more consistently, but it won't be as complete. So in 1931, a very famous Hungarian mathematician called Kurt Gödel, he came up with what is called in mathematics the incompleteness theorem. And this says that you cannot create any axiomatic system of mathematics which is both complete and consistent. It will be either complete, but can't be consistent, or it'll be consistent, but it can't be complete. What did he mean by that? He meant that any mathematical system has to start with at least one postulate that cannot be proven, at least one. If you start with just one, you can build very, very slowly, but it'll be much more consistent. If you start off with 9 postulates which can't be proven, you can build much faster, but it'll be less consistent. But even if you only start with one postulate, you can build a mathematical system which is predicated on faith. So even mathematics itself, you have to make an act of faith in this one postulate and say, yes, I'll accept this. I can't prove it, and math can't prove it to me, but if I accept this, everything else will make logical sense. And you can build very elegant systems that have real important ramifications in the real, quote-unquote, world. The same thing is true in physics. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle tells us that at the subatomic level, you can't simultaneously know the position and the momentum of a subatomic particle. You can't do that. And it's not because we're not clever enough to do it. It's because the scientific method itself is incapable of doing that. It can't do it. And so you have to take that on faith. The whole notion of the Big Bang, personally, I think is a ludicrous explanation for the origin of the universe. I think in 20 years' time, we're going to look back at it and say, how could we ever have believed that to be the case? But even if you accept the Big Bang, here's what they're asking you to accept. You grant us this ginormous miracle that we can't explain to you. that something banged. We don't know why, but something banged. And if you accept that something banged, we can explain a whole bunch of other stuff to you. So they're asking us to make this extraordinary, act of faith. So science itself is predicated on faith. Without faith, you can't go very, very far in the scientific endeavor. Now, my next point then is there is a spirituality to science when you know how to do science well, as indeed there is a science of spirituality. So what would a spirituality of science look like? It would have to include the observer. It would have to acknowledge that you can only start understanding science when you've understood the person who's doing the science. And we're beginning to understand this a little bit in quantum mechanics. It's called the observer effect. In some senses, whether light behaves as a particle or a wave is determined to some extent by the methodology of the observation. And so the essence of all science is you have to start with the inside. And that's why people like Socrates will say, man, know thyself, or the unexamined life is not worth living, or Gautama Siddhartha will call himself the Buddha, the one who woke up to know how things really are, who he really was, or why Jesus Christ will talk again and again and again about staying awake. If the householder knew at what stage the burglar was going to break in and steal, he'd stay awake. And so again and again and again there's this notion of everything begins with self-knowledge. So at one stage I created this formula, I think I ran it by you once before, that I call the equation of enlightenment. And it has 4 factors. So it's ax1 plus bx2 plus cx3 plus dx4 equals enlightenment. And so what is x1, x2, x3, x4? x1 is self-awareness. You can't do anything meaningfully without being self-aware. You can do stuff without being self-aware. It's not meaningful, and it's not ultimately aligning you with the real truth. You can only arrive at real truth if you know who you are yourself. So if you think you're your physical body, you can't do real science. If you think that you are your emotions, you can't do real spirituality. If you think you are the relationships you're in, or the roles you play, or the jobs you do, you can do neither good science nor good spirituality. So the essence of all scientific inquiry, whether it's into spiritual stuff or into scientific stuff, it all begins with self-knowledge. You have to know that you're a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for incarnation, and that ultimately there is only God. That even the notion of the separate soul is an illusion. It's the first illusion on the way out from God and the last illusion on the way back in. Because ultimately there is only God. Everything we see, and every one of us that sees and that observes or that witnesses is literally God in drag. Every one of us is God having a particular kind of experience. And when we don't start with that, we can't go anywhere. So the essence of the scientific methodology, as far as I'm concerned, is the realization of who the I am that is making these observations and come up with these kinds of theories. So it has to begin with the self. So any model of science which keeps consciousness out of the equation is bound to fall on its face again and again and again. You can't do science unless you know who you are, who's doing the science. And you understand the very process of perception, sensation, intelligence, soul. Without the knowledge of these things, you can't do science and you can't do spirituality. So that's factor 1, x1. x2 is intelligence. And by intelligence, I mean the ability now to make observations in the physical arena and to begin identifying patterns, as I mentioned before, create hypotheses, set up experimentation, prove them in other laboratories. And that's what I mean by intelligence. The ability to use our rational faculties to observe and to make connections between and identify patterns among our data. So without that, we can't do science, and without that, we can't do spirituality. And the third one, I would say, is wisdom. And wisdom is how we know the metaphysical world. And the realization that the physical universe is a manifestation of, or a projection of, a much deeper reality, which is the metaphysical cosmos. The Greeks had 2 words. They spelled cosmos in 2 ways. They spelled it with a C and they spelled it with a K. When they spelled it with a C, it meant the physical universe. When they spelled it with a K, it meant the metaphysical underpinnings of which the physical universe is merely a projection or a manifestation. So wisdom is the ability to be able to interact with this metaphysical dimension. And I redefined wisdom a few weeks ago, where I said that, in my opinion, wisdom is the heart's ability to translate all experiences into love. That's real wisdom. And that is the basis of all metaphysics. Metaphysics is based on the wisdom which allows us to take any experience we have, and translate it into love. That's real wisdom. That's how the metaphysical world works. That's number 3. That's the third factor, X3. And X4 is compassion. Now that you've understood who you are, now that you've wrestled with the physical environment in which you find yourself, now that you have begun to come to grips with the metaphysical underpinnings, you have to reach out in love and compassion to all God's creatures, not just all other human beings, and certainly not all just people who are fellow citizens of the same nation, but all sentient beings of whatever kind, whether it's flora or fauna, and respond to them and react to them with compassion and with love. And for me, that becomes the science, that becomes the spirituality of science. When science is done in that way, it is a deeply, deeply spiritual exercise. And this is how we get the likes of Tyler de Chardin, brilliant scientist in his own right as a paleontologist and a deep mystic. And I coined the term years and years and years ago for such a person. I called such a person a mysticist, somebody who's a cross between a mystic and a scientist, somebody who has the wisdom of the metaphysical and the intelligence of the physical and can cross-fertilize these two things together. So my final point then is the science of spirituality. Just as surely as there is a spirituality in real science, there's a scientific approach to real spirituality. And this is what Jesus is inveighing against today. He says, the word that was used, I left out one word, he called them hypocrites. He said, when you see a cloud coming from the west, you say it's going to rain. And of course they would, because the west, if you live in Israel, the west is the Mediterranean. And if there's a cloud coming in from the Mediterranean, it's going to bring moisture with it, it'll rain. If the wind is coming from the south, he says, it's going to be hot. Of course it is, because it's coming from the desert, the Judean desert. So if the wind is coming in from the desert, it's going to be really, really hot. And Christ says, you hypocrites. You know how to read the sun and the stars and the sky and the earth, but you don't know how to read the present time. In other words, you're not bringing the same level of intelligence to your spirituality as you're bringing to your kind of weather forecasting. So what does it look like when we bring the scientific method into our spirituality? What does it look like at that stage? So I went through the scientific method as basically observation, data, putative pattern, hypothesis, experimentation, replication, principle, model, tweaking, dismantling, etc. That's the scientific method. We have to bring the same scientific method to our spirituality. And so we have to begin looking at what works and what doesn't work, what really makes us compassionate, loving people as individuals, as communities, as nations, and as a global family of people on planet Earth. What works and what doesn't work. Very definitely, dogma doesn't work. Infallibility doesn't work. They certainly have not worked spiritually. So what does work in the course of our spirituality? And I'm going to suggest maybe 9 or 10 just little practices and just say a few phrases about each one. If we're serious about our spirituality, we have to be dedicated scientists or mysticists in the process. And so the first thing I would say is that we have to create sacred space and sacred time in our lives. So a sacred space is either that there's some location to which we have access, maybe it's a church, maybe it's a forest, maybe it's the ocean, whatever works for you, some place that you can go to on a regular basis where you can be alone with your thoughts and with your soul. That practice of getting away from the noise on a regular basis, having some place, is really, really important to the science of spirituality. Similarly, or you could be just a little corner of a room in your house where you have maybe a genealogy of your ancestors, and you burn incense and you take your shoes off and you spend time there just in quietude. So finding some kind of sacred space or creating it. Secondly, a sacred time. That there have to be, periods during the day or the week or the month or the year which are dedicated to this exercise of spirituality. There's a reason why the churches, one of the things they got right is they create special kinds of feast days, Easter or Christmas or Ascension or Assumption or whatever. They're trying to give us opportunities and occasions and particular times when we're invited into that space, or the Sabbath rest for Judaism. So it means the model I operate with, and I know it's really, really difficult for people who are trying to raise kids or hold down jobs or whatever, is that we try to create at least an hour of total silence in the day. 1 hour of total silence a day. A half a day of total silence in a week. A weekend of silence in a month, and a week of silence in the year. Now, I realize that's really difficult for a lot of people who are holding down jobs or working, have kids, whatever. I understand that. But to try to move towards some such arrangement where there's some kind of scheduled quiet time or sacred time in your life in which you're absolutely silent, whether you do that in the sacred space or you find it in the middle of the chaos, but that you dedicate some time of silence on a regular basis. That's part of the science of spirituality. I think learning what forgiveness is really about, that's crucial to a science of spirituality. The realization that forgiveness is not just lying down and let people walking all over you. That forgiveness is the realization that ultimately there is only one of us, God. And that every single one of us is God having some kinds of experiences. And therefore that, any refusal to forgive the other is an autoimmune disease. Because what's happening is the system is at war with itself. And so some effort at forgiving, and we know very, very well that when I hold unforgiveness in my heart, I'm the guy who's suffering. Very, very likely the guy that I'm really angry with doesn't even know I'm angry with him, or has forgotten the incident, years ago. And I'm schlepping it around for 10 more years. I'm the guy who's suffering. So the inability to forgive is a huge impediment to deep spirituality. In fact, in one famous passage in Mark's Gospel, when Jesus is talking about prayer, he says, pray to God and everything will be granted you. But first, forgive each other from your heart. In other words, prayer can only work when it's coming from a clean heart. It can't come from a heart that's closed up with unforgiveness. So forgiveness is hugely important. A third one I would say is feedback. Having the courage to, listen to feedback. Even if it's given for the wrong motives and even if it's widely exaggerated. I learn by understanding how other people perceive my actions or my words. So the ability just to take feedback as individuals, and as communities and as a nation, I think personally that is one of our biggest faults as Americans. We find it very, very difficult to accept feedback from the international community. Very, very difficult. And so we regard ourselves as, God's gift to democracy. Well, we plunder and pillage and kill because we're not open to feedback as a nation. So any community or any individual that's not open to feedback is not going to grow. We need weeders in our lives as much as we need fertilizers in our life. Fertilizers are those people who love us unconditionally, and they're very good for our self-image, but if we only surround ourselves with fertilizers, we become narcissists. We need weeders in our lives who are very happy to pluck out, the weeds they see. So feedback, I think, would be very, very important. Meditation was hugely important in the science of spirituality. The ability to totally clear the mind, and to realize, that the essence of you really exists in the silence between the thoughts and the silence between the words. That's who you really, really are. The thoughts and the words and the emotions are just literally, they're clouds in the sky of your consciousness. The sky is your consciousness, and the thoughts you're having, or the memories that are coming up, or the imaginations that are happening, or the physical sensations, they're like clouds floating across the sky of your consciousness. If you identify with the clouds, you're full of pain and fear. If you identify with the blue beyond, then that's your true essence. So some form of meditation seems to be really, really huge. I would say multi-perspectiving. It's a little bit like feedback. Multi-perspectiving is the ability to walk in other people's moccasins. You don't necessarily have to agree with them having walked in their moccasins. You don't have to just trade your ego for their ego. What's the value in that? Is you're just adopting somebody else's ego. But the ability to adopt many perspectives on any issue. If there are intelligent people on two sides of an argument, it must mean there's some merit to both sides of the argument. And so I'm far better employed trying to learn what your perspective is so I can grow a little bit rather than impose my version of the truth on top of you. So multi-perspectiving. Obviously, this is the essence of God. God adopts all of the perspectives of all her creatures. Every single creature that exists in the entire universe is a manifestation through which God perceives experience or receives experience. So God is the great multi-perspectiver. And in fact, I would say if there were one single indicator of how much progress you're making in your spiritual life, it is how many perspectives can I take on every issue I encounter. Doesn't mean I have to change my opinion, doesn't mean that, or agree with somebody. It means that maybe I have to be able to walk in their moccasins and adopt their perspective, at least temporarily. That would be another one. understanding the notion of karma. We think often that karma is some kind of a punitive mechanism whereby God punishes us in subsequent incarnations for sins we committed in previous ones. It has nothing got to do with that. Karma is the basic law of science, the law of cause and effect. You do A and B happens. You like B, great, keep doing A. You do C and D happens. You don't like D, okay, stop doing C. So it's the law of cause and effect. And it's the way in which we learn, because the essence of learning is twofold. It is feedback from our performance, and it is repetition. We learn by doing again and again and again, and by accommodating the feedback so we can adjust our aim. So this becomes really, really important at this stage then, learning to adopt these different understandings of karma. That karma, our real karma is that the life you were born into, the parents you have, the body you were given, the athletic abilities or the intellectual prowess or lack thereof, of any of these, this is karma in the sense that this is exactly what you signed up for. You made a preconception contract before you come in that you wanted particular parents to live in a particular time in human history, in a particular culture, in a particular body, with particular gifts and particular limitations, in order to learn whatever you chose to learn for a lifetime, compassion, courage, whatever. And now here you are, and you've got exactly what you asked for. That's karma. Instead of looking back and saying, I can't believe, why did I get a body like this? I'm not able to run, I have no musical ability, or whatever. Or I got an IQ of 85, or whatever I'm going to say to myself. You have exactly the gifts that you asked for in order to learn the lessons you wanted to learn and to perform the mission for which you've come. That's karma. Karma is the realization, wow, I got exactly the cards I asked for. Now, the result is how am I going to play those cards? Am I going to curse my fate, or am I going to play these cards to the best of my ability? I sent around a little video during the week, I don't know how many people saw it, of two sisters who were separated. One little girl went on to become an Olympic gold medalist. Her name was Seán, who was it? Yeah? She was on which team? Was it the 90s? She was part of the Magnificent Seven, the American team that swept the gymnastic world at the Olympics. Much more recent, was it? Okay. In Atlanta, okay. A beautiful kid. What she didn't know was that she had a little sister who was born without legs and was given up for adoption immediately because the father couldn't handle having a child who was disabled. And this child was given away and adopted by another family who refused. They said to the kid, there's no such word as can't in this family. And the kid went on to play volleyball and do gymnastics, and she had no legs, literally no legs whatsoever. And there's video. And her great idol was this gymnast who was 6 years older than her. And she would watch in fascination. And finally, she made contact with her. And her parents found out because there was a mistake in the adoption papers. And the parents' name, or the birth parents weren't crossed out. And they found out that this little child without the legs was also Marciano. She was a sister, the sister that was given away at birth. And there's this extraordinary meeting of these two kids. But there you have this little girl, literally without legs. The happiest little kid and the most brilliant athlete. Literally, she's playing volleyball, sitting on her tush, over the court. And doing gymnastics, bouncing in the air, and winning all kinds of trophies. I sent it around this week. If you check your COGL. It's just an 8-minute video. It's really, really, really brilliant. So that's what karma is. Karma is the ability to accept the hand I'm given and to play it to the best of my ability. And the final one I want to mention is practice, spiritual practice. And it came as a result of an email from a good friend of mine whom I won't identify, but he's sitting in the front row of the church on the right-hand side as you look up. Sorry. Because of a discussion we'd had, and he asked me, to explain love and different kinds of love. And I totally believe that love exists in 4 different kinds, and the practice of love is a very important spiritual practice. So there's 4 ways of loving. I call them the 4 C's. There's confirmatory love, by confirmation. There's the love of complementarity. There's the love of compensation, and there's the love of confrontation. Let me explain what I mean by those. And I'm going to use 2 analogies from 2 different sports because I don't know what sports you're into. I'm going to use tennis as an example, and I'm going to use American football as an example. So confirmatory love or confirming love is the attaboy kind of love, where you really appreciate what the other person is doing. Way to go! I love it. Yes. So imagine you're on a football team, and the wide receiver just got the ball and ran 70 yards downfield and scored a touchdown. And everybody in the whole team is jumping with joy that their mate has scored. That's the love of confirmation, where everybody gets behind a great performance and are really, really happy. Or you're playing doubles in tennis, and your partner has just hit, a service at 91 miles an hour. Way to go! And you're really, really happy, for your partner. So that's confirmatory love. The second kind of love is complementary love. We're members of teams, and not everybody can perform all the functions. It's not the function of the quarterback to, every time he gets the ball is snapped back, that he's got to run to the end line and score a touchdown. If he tries to do that, he's not going to succeed very, very, very often. He's going to get clobbered. So the idea of the team is that there's guys to pass it to, and there's guys running interference. And the guys running interference, who the big fat guys, who find it difficult even to stand up, they're as important to the team as the quarterback or the wide receiver. Yeah, so that's the love of complementarity. That each of these guys is vital to the organization. Yeah, the third kind of love is compensatory love. So somebody has a task on the team, but they literally drop the ball. And so a guy's rushing up the field and he drops the ball. It's going to be a turnover, but one of his teammates rushes in and gathers it up. Instead of wagging fingers at him, accidents happen. And so compensatory love is the ability to make up for the mistakes of others. Or like you're playing tennis, and the guy who's up at the net misses a very easy volley, and you've got to scramble to get it for him. So that's compensatory love. And then there's confrontational love. That's the fourth one, and it's very important. It's when somebody is really screwing up a lot and regularly. You've got to call them on their stuff. And so, for instance, if the quarterback insists every time he gets the ball in the snap, he's going to try to run for the end line. At some stage, the coach and the team members will say, buddy, you're going to sit out the next 3 matches. You're a member of a team. We're all in this team together. You can't be doing that kind of stuff. So you have to call him on his stuff. Or you're playing tennis, and your partner insists on going for every ball, whether it's the forecourt or the backcourt, left or right. He won't give you a chance to go anywhere near it. He's all over the place, messing up constantly, and you get no chance in the whole game. At some stage, you have to say, you know what? Find yourself a different tennis partner. I can't do this anymore. We'll ignore that remark, Susan. Did you all hear that? She said it was like me on the volleyball court. Feedback is good. Tell me more. I forgive you, Susan. It's okay. All right, good. Brilliant. So that's confrontational love, and that's really, really important. You have to be able to call people on their stuff. So for me, that's the science of spirituality. There has to be a science to it. There has to be some kind of empirical aspect to our spirituality. If we're not open to seeing whether or not the way we're living is working or not, then we just keep living the same way, and nothing changes and nothing happens. So it becomes really important then, that the science of spirituality and the spirituality of science. So I finish with one little final biblical quotation. There's this great phrase in the Gospel of Thomas, where he takes a statement which we find in the Synoptics, but he expands it very significantly. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's this statement of Jesus where he says, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. Thomas takes this central statement and he expands it very significantly. And what he says is this, he says, those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. And when they find, they will be disturbed. And when they are disturbed, they will marvel. And when they marvel, they will rule. And when they rule, they will rest. So according to Thomas, it's not a 2-stage process, it's a 6-stage process. And the third stage is really, really, really important. If you are serious about your spirituality, and you start digging and searching and meditating and studying and thinking, you're going to come to some kind of a faith crisis, inevitably. You'll begin to realize that the religious system which you were brought up was deeply, deeply, deeply flawed. That they traded dogma for mystical experiences, and that they traded institution for community. And you begin to say, I can't do it like this anymore. But now, what are you going to do? Your community is going to get pulled out from under you. You're going to be regarded as some kind of a pariah. You may have even internal conflicts. There's a crisis of identity. If I'm not this, who the hell am I? It's inevitable if you're serious about your spirituality or about your science. A real scientist must be prepared to be disturbed by his findings. If he is never disturbed by his findings, it means he's not studying outside of the box. He's just doing the same old, same old, same old. Any serious inquiry in any discipline, whether it's a scientific discipline or a spiritual discipline, is going to bring you to Christ says in your life, which are the stepping stones to huge quantum leaps in consciousness. And at that stage, when you get to the next stage, you begin to realize, you begin to marvel, at the disturbance. Why did I allow this to disturb me? The new truth is much greater, much more all-encompassing, and it fills me with love, where the other one filled me with maybe mere obedience.